Okay, welcome. We're going to be covering Chapter 12 today. That's going to be the prison experience and prisoner reentry. After this, we will have really completed the bulk of the course in many ways. We'll have finished this third large unit. The first large unit was really about the police. The second one was about the courts. This one's going to be about, the third unit is about prisons and jails. So we'll jump in, and then I'll have a little bit to say about chapters 13 and 14 as we go on. Okay. All institutions have an organizational culture. And the more elaborate the institution, the more people are involved in the institution. You could say the more robust the institution is, the more that organizational culture influences people inside and outside. So prisons we look at as total institutions. A person in prison, and we're talking about the prisoners here, but to a lesser extent the guards as well, lives completely inside that institution. It provides all his necessities of life, food, it provides companionship, it provides shelter, it provides care. These are called in sociology and in studies total institutions. Another example in religion, for example, would be a monastery. So a monk lives in a monastery, or if it is a nunnery, a nun lives in a nunnery, and their whole life is devoted to it. So they live, breathe, and sleep everything that goes on in there. To a lesser extent, the military is another good example. Someone in the military, we tend to look at militaries as total institutions, particularly during times of war or conflict. But to return to prisons, there's really no way for the prisoners to get out of prison short of at the end of their sentence or escape being a relatively rare event. So this total institution has to and does take someone who enters into the prison as a civilian, and then through a process, and we call this process prisonization, that person, mainly men, is converted from a civilian into a convict. And then of course when they get out, they don't instantaneously revert to a civilian again. We typically will call them ex-convicts. Okay, this process in all institutions would be socialization, and that can either be very extensive or very moderate. So socialization in prison, which we call prisonization, is very intensive, very complete. Socialization in the Boy Scouts is much less. But socialization that would take place inside a monastery, or socialization that takes place inside the Marine Corps, much more intensive. So in prison, this process of socialization is called prisonization. You can see how the root prison and ization. Criminologists, people who study crime, focus on the adaptation of human beings once they're incarcerated. One of the most amazing attributes of man is our adaptability. If you think about it, unlike almost any other animal on the planet, possible exception of cockroaches, I guess, humans live everywhere. We live in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, in the deserts, in the forests, in the jungles, in the savannas, in cities, in countryside. We live everywhere. We can adapt almost anywhere to any behavior climatically. We can adapt almost anywhere to any behavior institutionally. So it's not surprising that this skill of adaptation is applied to prison itself. And inmates are changed by this process. So they will develop different personalities. And I have had clients that went to prison, and they quite definitely, depending upon the length of their sentence, the severity of their sentence, where they were serving it, would go in with one mindset and one level of behavior. And when they came out the other side, it was a much different person if it was a long period of time. And you can have different attitudes going into prison, just like you could have different attitudes going into the Marine Corps, different attitudes going into a monastery. or the Boy Scouts. So you could just do your time, you could be more disorganized about it, you could be engaging in gleaning or jailing, and if we had more time we'd go into some of these adaptations, but these are all ways in which people will adapt to prison. So who is in prison? Well, we're going to mention women, we're going to talk a little bit about them, but this is primarily a male game. Most of the people in prisons are men. Most of the people in prison are young men, younger men. So we have seen an increase in the number of women. We've seen more minorities go to prison in the last 3 decades in the United States. We've also seen more people go to jail for drugs and immigration violation. Because America has such long prison sentences, one of the results of this is that our prison population is aging. There are prisoners that are serving longer and longer sentences, and some of these obviously are life sentences. So you could go online, and I might try to provide a link to you later, and you could hear the warden of Angola Prison, which is in Louisiana. It's a maximum security prison, and he has inmates that are sentenced to life there. Well, he has some inmates that are in their 70s and 80s, and part of his problem as a warden is he obviously can't keep them in the general population. They don't represent a threat necessarily outside. Very few 80-year-olds or 90-year-olds are direct threats to people. They're also very expensive to keep incarcerated. As people approach the end of their lives, they require more medical care. They require more personal care. So this aging inmate population is straining correctional budgets. And the Supreme Court, in the case of Brown versus Plata, has said you have to give people in prison basic, adequate health care. You don't have to, perform facelifts for them. You don't have to provide any pill they want, but you do have to give them basic health care. One of the things we've also seen in prison is a rise in mental illness. I think there's always been a fair amount of mental illness in prison. I think we have gotten better in the last 30 and 40 years at spotting mental illness, to some extent at treating it. But also, to be honest about that, in the 1970s in the United States, we had hundreds of thousands of people in mental hospitals. We've closed most of those mental hospitals. So here in Raleigh, we had Dorothea Dix, and we had large facilities like that where you would have hundreds of people that were mentally ill that would be held. Most of those have shut down. Only very small numbers of people are in mental hospitals. Those people didn't disappear. Those people went somewhere, and one of the places they went is they went to prison. So now we have to deal with you have to deal with people in prison that can have schizophrenic episodes, depressive episodes. They can be violent, they can be aggressive, they can be passive, they can be catatonic. It runs the gauntlet, as mental illness does. We also should look at rehabilitation. If one of the purposes of prison is to take someone who committed a crime and to convince him not to commit future crimes, or to give him the skills that he doesn't have to commit a future crime, that's rehabilitation. So this has some positive benefits. Teaching people things, for example, literacy, teaching people to read and write. It can be difficult for college students like yourselves to understand that, but there's a significant number of people that are functionally illiterate in the United States. And that makes their lives very difficult. We are in a literate culture. So if they can get the skills of reading and writing, or if they can develop vocational skills, not only will this alleviate the boredom, and boredom is a dangerous thing inside prison, it'll improve their mental health. It will definitely reduce recidivism rates. Now the problem is these programs can be expensive. So in the short term, you might say, well, I'm going to cut my GED program. I'm going to cut my vocational training program. And you will save an amount of short-term money, but you will raise your recidivism rates. You'll have more of your inmates coming back in, so you're going to have to build more jails. And you will increase violence inside prison as prisoners have nothing to do, as they become bored, as they become violent, or if they seek out things that are actively bad for them, such as joining gangs inside prison. Violence in prison. There is no question that prisons and jails are dangerous places because much of this is predicated on violence. Again, as a college student, some of you have been exposed to a level of violence, but by and large, your day-to-day relationships with people is governed outside of a hierarchy of violence. Prison, on the other hand, is fundamentally force. The guards have the opportunity to use force, and inmates have the opportunity to use force against each other. So people are violent in prison. One of the reasons they can be violent is the more violent you are, the more aggressive you are, the tougher you are, the higher you are in the hierarchy of the prison. This informal hierarchy. It deters others from victimizing you. It enhances self-image. It can be a mechanism through which you obtain sexual relief. It can be a mechanism through which you acquire material goods. So violence is used in prison, particularly male prisons, not as much in female prisons. Okay, prison violence, why do we see it? Well, part of it is what is called the deprivation model. A sense of frustration grows because the individual is denied basic freedoms, consumer goods, sex, other staples of life. And we're going to talk a little bit more about sex, but as an example here, one of the things we know is that if you deny young, aggressive males sexual outlets, heterosexual outlets, they will take alternatives, either self-gratification or homosexual gratification. Group violence in prison. There are serious problems with groups acting in concert inside prisons. Sometimes we get riots. Fortunately, they're relatively rare, but we also have a kind of underlying institutional group violence, and these would be gangs in prisons. Many of the gangs that we see on the streets of America today had their starts in prisons. So we use this deprivational model to explain why individuals in prison are more violent. So they can get what small amount of goods, sex, freedom that they can get, and they can use violence doing it. Okay, if you went to Central Prison, and we have tours of Central Prison, but if you go to Central Prison with us, one of the things that you'll notice is that by and large, these are very segregated institutions. And I don't mean that the prison says all African Americans have to be in cell block C and all white Americans have to be in cell block A and all Hispanic Americans have to be in cell block D. It is primarily self-segregation. In fact, it's difficult for an inmate to mingle with other races, other groups. If you go to most prisons, the only place you pretty much see that is in blocks, groupings, where prisoners have been removed from the general population, often because they were snitches or had cooperated with the police and or the prison administration. And they were removed from general population and they were put with other people who had cooperated that also had to be removed. There you're going to see some mixing, but if you go in, you will see self-segregation. You go into the prison yards and typically, not always, but typically, whites will be with whites, blacks will be with blacks, Hispanics will be with Hispanics. And this can even be subdivided. So it's not unusual at all to see, for example, if we took Hispanics, Guatemalans hang around Guatemalans, El Salvadorians hang around El Salvadorians, indigenous groups hang around indigenous. All of these can self-segregate. And part of this is you identify. It gives you friends. It gives you access. It gives you help. So these are the nucleuses around which gangs are formed, and gangs are very common in prisons. So they are seen as security threat groups. Now, it's interesting because I've talked some about European countries in these lectures, but if you were to contrast gangs in Europe and gangs in America, one of the things you'd notice is there's more of a prevalence of religious gangs in Europe. So you often will have Muslim gangs, radicalizing gangs. You don't tend to see those in the United States. You saw some in the 60s, not terribly common, but a prison gang can be defined as when groups get together, and they typically will share some commonality, race, ethnicity, and they will engage in activities. Prostitution, they will sell weaker members, or they will control weaker members of the prison. They will sell them for sex. They will sell drugs. They will gamble. They will loan money or goods. There have been several studies that have shown that the randomized testing of prisoners produces as high, if not higher, rates of positives for drug use than in general populations. So prison gangs are very important to social structure. And obviously, when you get 3 or more of them engaged in any sort of criminal activity, this is a threat to the formal and to the informal structure. So we estimate that at least 30% of male inmates, about a third, and this would be higher in the maximum institutions than in the minimums, are gang members, and only about 9% of female inmates. One of the things you can do is you can break them up if they become too destructive or too controlling or too much of a threat, and that's something that's done routinely. But it's very difficult to combat them in prison. It's pretty much an accepted problem for prison to deal with. Okay, prison employment. Now we're going to flip and talk a little bit about the corrections officers. And one of the things that happens, and I've talked about this before, is that common terms are used. So most people outside the criminal justice field do not call them correctional officers. They call them guards. That is the common term. It's somewhat disrespectful. Corrections officers is a noble profession, as much as a police officer is, as much as others are. They are serving, they are protecting the public. So how do you become a corrections officer? Well, one of the things is the standards have been rising. Like in all parts of the criminal justice, for police officers, standards have been rising, also for corrections officers. There's typically a civil service exam. There's typically a training program, classwork, and physical education. Just like the police, the corrections officers are broken up into ranks that are close to the military. So you will usually see corrections officer, which would be the enlisted man in the military, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and depending upon the prisons, Alabama, Mississippi, New Orleans, North Dakota, all of those would have different terminology beyond this. Beyond captain, you might see major or colonel, and sometimes they will just change the term to some sort of management term like vice warden, assistant warden, warden. All those are terms. Excuse me. Okay. Typically, your job categories that you'll do, there are block officers, work detail officers. These are pretty much self-explanatory. Industrial shop and school officers, yard officers, tower guards. One of the things that tends to happen, of course, is that you could call those, in a general sense, line officers. Those are usually entry positions, and as you move up, you typically, if you want to get ahead financially and in terms of status in the system, you do want to go into administration. So inmate discipline policies, if we start looking at that, have 3 general goals. We want to have a safe and orderly living environment. We want to have respect for authority, if you're from South Park. You want to teach the values and respectful behavior that influences the inmates. So you don't want to beat people into obedience. You want them to obey because they will obey and they want to obey. Obviously, sometimes prisoners don't behave, so we have sanctioning if they violate the rules. And the people who enforce this are the corrections officers. And it's a very stressful part of their job. Because remember, you might be dealing with someone who's mentally ill. You might have been trying to control them, and they might have become out of control. They can become violent. They can spit at you. They can throw feces at you. They can attack you. Typical punishment at the severe end in the United States is loss of privileges all the way up to solitary confinement. Now, can they use force? Well, not to beat people, but to restrain them, yes, they can. Corrections officers may use force when they're acting in self-defense, just like a police officer or you or me. They can go to defend a third person, either another guard or another inmate. Excuse me. They can uphold the rules of the institution. They can prevent escapes. They can prevent crimes. They do not have total freedom. They may not be malicious or sadistic. So there's no cruelness here, or there should not be. So we're usually looking for a proportional use of force as necessary. Okay, female correction officers, for many years we didn't have them. Gradually, starting in the 1960s, much like we saw more female police officers, we began to see more female corrections officers. And the belief was, well, you really can't put women in prisons. They're not strong enough. It would cause disciplinary breakdowns. You'd have so many problems. It actually took several lawsuits for women to be hired full-time, and today there are over 150,000 women working in our correctional facilities, and we haven't had a big problem with them. No more of a problem than we have had with male corrections officers. So the primary problem we see here is sexual misconduct. And this exact same issue is mirrored with men. So yes, you do have female guards that have inappropriate contact with inmates, but you have male guards that have inappropriate contact with inmates. It is not that unusual for female inmates, for example, that are being watched by male guards, and those should be the only men they see, to get pregnant. So pregnancy in prison is not unknown. It is also not impossible for a female guard to get pregnant or to engage in a relationship with, and I'm using the term guard there, and my mistake, should be corrections officer, to get in a relationship with a male inmate. Now, obviously these are improper and they call for discipline, but they do exist on both genders. There's nothing unique about deploying women here. Okay, protecting prisoners' rights. Now, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, so we have what are called the Civil War Amendments, the amendments that came after the American Civil War, which banned slavery and sought to institute certain basic rights. One of these is the 13th Amendment, and it has a specific exemption that says that you can treat inmates differently than other Americans. And traditionally, the courts followed what was called a hands-off doctrine. Sometimes you heard this called a civil death. When someone went into prison, the courts just took hands off. They said, that's not our problem anymore. Those aren't really Americans in the same sense of having all the other rights in the Constitution. By the 1970s, in part with the realization of the problems we had in our prisons, the courts began to challenge the hands-off doctrine, and they began to look at a balancing act between certain very basic rights for prisoners, not the full rights of a citizen, but certain minimal rights and what the prison wants, what the security needs of the correctional institution. So we see a series of cases really starting in the 1970s and into the 1990s and a little bit beyond. One of the most important ones is called Estelle versus Gamble. It came down in 1976. And it says if prisons are aware of a harmful institution, a harmful problem in their institution, and they don't take steps to remedy those conditions, then that is a violation of the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. It's called deliberate indifference. So if, for example, you knew that prisoners were routinely being beaten, or some were killed, and you knew about this and you did nothing, that'd be a violation. By 1990, we talked about what are the basic human needs that even as prisoners we have to guarantee them. Well, the basics to start with are food. And they don't get steak and lobster, but basic food, warmth, and some level of exercise. So even in supermaxes, for example, where inmates are in jail cells by themselves completely, they're in there for 23 hours, 23 and a half hours a day, and they will let them out to walk around an exercise yard. There can be some special concerns for female inmates. Very often there can be issues of parental stress, there can be issues of mental health, so female inmates tend to have more mental health problems, at least demonstrably, than the men. They also are far more likely to be victims of physical abuse and sexual abuse than men going into prison. They tend to be involved going into prison on unhealthy relationships. And they tend to show higher levels of poverty and homelessness than the general female population. So you've got this big basket of problems of female inmates coming in. One of the things you can look at here, the ethnicity of female prisoners. It's about 49% white, 21% African American, 17% Hispanic, 12% other. That's not very close to the breakdown of American overall population, but this would be closer than the male population if you looked at it by race. I want you to look though at the age. You'll notice that a significant percentage, 13%, are over 50 now, and 25% are between 40 and 49. Now the largest grouping is 30 to 39-year-olds, and then followed by 20 to 29-year-olds. Only the very young, 18, 19, is only about 1%. So that blue sliver there is going to be growing over time, and that's going to be of concern for us. But those issues, particularly look at the issues of people, women 20 to 29 and 30 to 39, this is going to raise the question of motherhood and of children. What do you do with people who have children and they go to prison? So this is what's called the motherhood problem. 70% of all female prisoners have at least one minor child. That means when you lock the mother up, then who's going to take care of the child? If they're the primary caregiver, the state's going to have to get involved. So you might have children in foster care. You might, and that's just going to add to your cost. Now, as far as violence inside women's prison, there's less gang violence. It's far less. Women tend to really recreate family units. So it's not at all unusual to see an older woman acting kind of as the center of a family. So they have a younger woman with them, they have an older woman, she's the center of this recreated family unit. It's very common to see older prisoners and younger prisoners together. And it's an attempt to recreate a pseudo family. It really is. Okay. Each year, 650,000 people get out of prison. So if there's 2 million plus people in prison, jails, whatever we're looking at, 3 million if you add in jails, 20% are going to get out every year or so. And that's very raw numbers, but we're close enough to talk like that. So you got 650,000 coming out. So you're going to have some challenges there. Now they can get out because they're paroled. That's pretty rare. You can get out because they maxed out their sentence. That's far more common. Some, it's pretty rare, are pardoned. I would say excessively rare, far less than 1%. And a small number are released on furloughs. That is increasing somewhat to use prisoners to go out temporarily for things like educational purposes and the rest. But more about that another time. You got a real problem, and that's the barrier to reentry. What are you going to do with these people? They have been in prison. You're going to let them out. They're going to have to make a living. Who's going to hire them? How are they going to be hired? Where are they going to live? How are they going to get housing? All these things means that you really need a transitional period. So one of the things we've learned is you can't do what you saw in the old days, where you gave them a bus ticket and $10 and said, okay, you're done. If you want to give them a realistic shot out there, it's better to give them some kind of transitional period, transitional housing, assistance in finding a job, so that they can go out and become productive members of society. One of the big problems is transportation. This is a car-centric culture, so they need to be someplace where either they have access to a bus, which means it's not going to be a rural environment, because there are basically no buses that run rurally routinely in America. So they're pretty much going to have to settle in the cities. It's going to be difficult to get housing. It's going to be difficult to get employment. And this can be complicated by what their age is. And remember, there are significant numbers that are mentally ill. Some of these mental illness is being exacerbated by their time in prison. What we want to do is we want to lower the recidivism rate. We don't want them coming back. So we try to promote desistance. We want to cut down on criminal activity, reintegrate them into society. And of course, I use the analogy, and it's a crude analogy, but I think it's helpful to think of it this way, of the alcoholic. I'm Irish American, and I'm going to assure you that there are more than a few alcoholics in my family. And if you were to ask me, when does an alcoholic stop drinking, I would tell you when he decides. It's very difficult to impose upon an alcoholic, okay, you're going to be sober. You're going to stop drinking. They'll find a way. You have got to motivate a prisoner coming out of prison to desist from criminal activity. You've got to have him ready to make the decision himself. So very often we're looking at bridges, halfway houses, mechanisms of employment. We're looking at ways in which we're making it easier for him to make that step. One of the things you can do is you can limit the general public's knowledge of what someone did. You know, suppose someone's been in jail for 5 years for selling drugs, and he gets out and he has to put on every application, whether it's for a car washer or a brain surgeon, that yeah, he was in jail for drugs. Well, he might never get hired in a job, and the only way he might be able to make money, go back selling drugs. So there's an argument to be made that you should allow, particularly nonviolent offenders, to not have to disclose their history. That's called ban the box, or sometimes expungement laws, which would be removing the sentence completely. Sex offenders are a special case. Sex offenders is something we focus on. Particularly, we focus on things like child molestation. Very often when someone is let out of prison and they have been accused of child molestation, we're going to give them special conditions. We want them to get psychiatric treatment. Often we want them to have access to drugs that lower libido. We don't want them in contact with children. We don't want them to own toys that could lure children. We don't want them employed near children. So all of these things can be very important and are usually conditions of release. We also have sex offender notification laws. If you're convicted of a crime in North Carolina and it's a sex crime, you are going to be on the North Carolina Sex Offender Registry. And any citizen can go on that registry. You can do it today. Just type in North Carolina Sex Offender Registry. You'll go to the website. You can bring it up, and it will give you a map. You put in your address. It'll give you a map of where they live. They have to register where they're living. They have to register where they work. They have to do this for long periods of time, sometimes forever. Sometimes it's 5 years or 10 years. Sometimes it's so difficult for them that they occasionally will concentrate There's a somewhat notorious, really it's a town in Florida, where there were so many restrictions. I can't live here because it's too near a school. I can't live here because it's too near a hospital. I can't live here, that people moved to this town in Florida because there were no schools, there were no children, and there was a number of sex offenders, large number of sex offenders living in these small town. Okay. Civil confinement. We don't see a lot of this, particularly in North Carolina, but under laws, sometimes you can take someone who served a criminal sentence and say he still represents a danger to society and we want to civilly hold him. We do this with people who are violently mentally ill. We do this rarely with people who have sexual proclivities that are dangerous, particularly to children. All right. At that point, we've really concluded this lecture. Now we're going to be moving on. From this point, we're going to go to chapter 13 and 14. These are kind of catch-all chapters to some extent. We're going to look at juveniles next time, but really coming down to the end of the course. So pay attention, stay motivated. We're almost done.